hope you enjoyed the video, guys. Thanks for watching, and make sure to leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe to the Sinful Nation and WorstNightmare. Again, I want to thank WorstNightmare for doing such an amazing job, and it was a real pleasure working with you. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, stay sinful with your comments and support. Without further anticipation, let's begin. Okay, so this all happened about 3 years ago or so. I was around 17 years old. I'm not going to dramatize anything, but let me go ahead and say that I think, personally, that this is a pretty bizarre story. There are some details about my actual relationship I'm going to leave out. I kind of want an answer to this story or question, but I don't think I'll ever get one. I've been wanting to get some outside opinions on it, aside from friends and family too, though. So here it goes. My ex, Jane, and I lived about an hour away from each other. We met at a park out of state and ended up living kind of close. We hit it off and dated a month after we met. Our entire relationship lasted a year, and she was my first girlfriend. From the very beginning of the relationship, she would discuss her best friend named Patrick. He was in his late 20s. She, as a reminder, was 17 and worked in a bookstore. He lived in our town, and she had known him since she was 13. From very early on, I thought the stories she would tell me about him were outlandish. She would talk about watching him get into bar fights with a guy that went by Hammer, how once they pretended to rob a gas station, but left money behind on the counter and had to jump off a roof to escape security, in which Patrick broke his ankle. Another time, Patrick got a brand new Mustang that they wanted to crash into a lake, so they jumped out at the last second. She told me that one toward the end of our relationship, at which point I was completely skeptical of everything she said. You get the idea. The stories she told seemed clearly exaggerated or downright fake. Part of me thought she was trying to impress me for whatever reason. Here are some important facts that I don't exactly know where to put, so I'll lay them out here. Number 1. Jane was an artist. She drew all the time in her journal. She rarely drew people as they actually were. She drew people as monsters or animals. For example, she always drew me as a giraffe. She was good at that. Number 2. Patrick's last name, according to her, was pronounced and spelled a certain way. Willington. Patrick Willington. Number 3. Patrick's dad owned a successful company out of the state that Patrick would inherit. Number 4. Jane had a much older brother, who was in his late 20s as well, that had joined the military and moved to Korea. She only saw him every few years or so. Okay, now continuing. Jane would tell me that Patrick was very protective of her. She would tell him about me, and he would always be unsure of what he thought. She said he wanted to beat me up sometimes, and that he'd hurt me if I ever hurt her. If she told him about something silly I did, he'd think I was an idiot and call me stupid. He also thought I was gay. This is all, of course, secondhand information. Never once in the entire relationship do I think I spoke to him. I'll get to that later. I'd also like to remind everyone that this was my first relationship. I was very insecure, very confused, and there was more going on in it that complicated some things. I did not have the best rationality, as you may have already deduced from how weird some of this sounds. The thing is, I really didn't have any reason not to believe her, you know? She had no reason to lie about any of this, but I was still skeptical. Sometimes Jane would go to Patrick's house really late at night, she'd say. She said she'd sleep on his couch and that he would literally throw her out of the house in the morning. Sometimes she said she had to sneak out of her house to go to his. He lived within walking distance, apparently. One time later in the relationship, Patrick invited her on an out-of-state trip back to his hometown. They were going to stay in a mountain cabin for a week. I was not happy about that. I was more upset when she said she wouldn't tell her parents and that they'd leave on a bus in the morning. Now, at this point in the relationship, I was very unsure of what exactly was going on with this Patrick person. But Jane said that if I told her parents about this trip, she wouldn't be able to go, and that Patrick would hate me and she'd be pissed. It was important for her because Patrick apparently would be forced to move away soon to work at his dad's company, and she said she'd never see him again, so she needed to go. Well, when the day came for her to leave, also I did discuss this with friends and family at the time. Patrick never showed up to get her. She was very upset, even though he'd be back in town one more time. Oh, another tidbit. Jane's parents never once mentioned Patrick, ever. She never brought him up around them either. The only time she mentioned Patrick to anyone else was to my dad once, after we broke up. She told my dad one of the most outlandish stories I mentioned. Why she met my dad after we broke up is for a different, unrelated reason that will not add to this story. My dad was flabbergasted, basically. I had told him about all this, but hearing it in person was crazy. Patrick was to have a birthday party once, before the mountain cabin trip thing happened. I was invited. It was going to be at his house starting at midnight. I said I couldn't go to that, but I'd get him a present. I got him some toolkit thing she said he'd like, and gave it to her for him. She said she brought it and that he did in fact like it. She said the party lasted until 6 a.m. Patrick sent me a text from his phone once, when she was with him. It was standard behavior for him. He said I was a pansy or something, and that he'd beat me up. That was early on. Sorry things are out of order. I'm just kind of typing them as I remember. I'll edit anything I forget. Now, here's where I think things get very interesting. Jane lived nearby an elementary school. She walked with me there and said his house was close to it. So she leads me back to the school, where there is woodland. She brings me to the edge of the woods and has me look in. I see this very old wooden tin house sort of structure. It has broken windows, it's filthy, and it's falling apart. The path to it is covered by bushes and trees. She said that this was his house. Oh, at this point, he had moved to work at the company out of state, by the way. I asked if she was joking. She said no, and that he wasn't very tidy, even when he did live there. I thought briefly that maybe the house was just weird looking on the outside, but actually good on the inside. But there's no way it was. It was abandoned. Anyways, the same day, she asked if I wanted to go inside. It was hot, getting dark. No one knew where we were exactly, and I didn't want to get cut up by bushes or go in this sketchy house. So I said maybe another time. She insisted, saying that Patrick wanted us to check on things, but eventually gave up. This was very close to the end of our relationship. I asked her a few questions, like, you went through those bushes and stuff every time you went to see him? And she said yes, but they had overgrown since he left. I also asked how he drove out of his house, how anyone visited him otherwise, how he got his mail. She eventually realized that maybe I didn't exactly believe her, and then she got mad. I said I was sorry and that it was just different to me. She insisted it was true. I let it go. Well, we ended up breaking up shortly after. But I had a hard time coping with the breakup, and ended up speaking with her again later. She was on a bus with her class to go on some trip. I lost connection with her and called her back. A young man answered. I asked who it was. He said Patrick Willingson, not Willington. So I opened up with a question about his last name, and also why he had her phone. He said that was always his last name. He said he was on his office phone. I kept asking him questions about himself that only the real Patrick would know. I heard noises in the background. He would pause for a minute before answering. I think she just handed the phone to a classmate and told him what to say, frankly. That's the only real reason to that. Well, he hung up and I called her back. Jane answered and said that Patrick told her I somehow got connected to his phone, since he was in her recent contacts or something. It's clearly bullshit. But I played along, asking one more time about the last name, to which she had no idea what I was talking about, saying it was always Willingson. and we left it at that. Oh, and he wanted to beat me up, of course, badly, for breaking her heart. Well, I kept speaking to her for a week or two, and we both finally got closure about the relationship. But as I was recounting this experience with a friend, I realized something. Probably just a creepy coincidence. But I had said Jane was an artist, and that she always drew people as other things. Well, I saw many drawings of Patrick. She said he always wore this dark coat and ripped pants or something. She, as usual, didn't draw him as a human. She drew him as a skeleton. Really creeped me out for whatever reason when I remembered that. I may be forgetting some other weird things that happened, but that's the main stuff. Now, to tie it all together, here's some stuff I've done about it since. I tried using Google Earth to look at where his house was, since I remember exactly where she showed me. The trees are too thick to see in, and there is construction nearby, so it may not even be there anymore. I have not gone back in person since it is so far away and also close to her house. I have Googled and researched in countless ways Patrick's name, both names, and anything I could remember, and I had no useful results. She used to mention him on social media sometimes. A friend of mine who had trouble grasping all this found her profile and saw him mentioned. Recently, too. I have a few theories. My first theory: Patrick was just this sort of imaginary friend character she made to fill the place of her much older brother, who moved away and didn't see often. Her brother and Patrick were the same age, after all, and kinda had similar personalities, because I did meet her brother one time. Number two, it was all bullshit she made up for whatever reason, to impress me sometimes, to coerce me other times. Number three, it was part of a much bigger disorder or problem, which is possible. Jane had other issues that I will not disclose, so it isn't impossible. Number four, Patrick did exist in some way, shape, or form, but she highly, highly exaggerated him and rarely saw him, so she told me whatever she wanted about him. Kind of fits with the brother theory. It may not be as creepy to all of you since you're on the outside of my social circle, but like I said, that's why I'm posting. But to me, personally, I am bothered by this. Jane had a tendency to be very violent and say threatening things. Why did she make it all up? Why did she show me that house and say it was his? What was in the house? Regardless of if anyone lived there, did she ever actually go in, like she said she did? Did she sleep there sometimes or visit late at night like she said? If so, what in the world was she doing? Did someone really somehow live there? I really highly doubt it. Why did he have such strong feelings about me? Why did she change his last name? Why did she do that weird thing with the phone and classmate? How many of her other loved ones know about this? What would have happened if I went in that house with her? It was as I brushed over during the end stages of our relationship, which were very unhealthy and bent. Some of this probably heightened my anxiety, but I do think it's a weird story. I plan on using it for a fictional story one day, and of course changing some stuff for it. But anyways, thanks for listening.
I am a white female living in an Asian country that is not my home country. This story happened about a year ago when I was 17, when I was riding the bus home at night after hanging out with my friends. After sitting on the bus for a while, a woman sat down next to me. I didn't really think anything of it until she motioned for me to take out my earphones and began talking to me. First, she asked me my name. I don't usually give out my real name to strangers, so I told her it was Natalie, one of my go-to fake names. Then she asked for my last name, which I thought was weird. My last name is really uncommon here because it's a Central European name. This was around the time the Ashley Madison thing happened, so I said it was Madison. Kind of silly, I know, but it worked. Next, she asked me where I was from, and I said the U.S., which is true, but didn't go into any more detail. Then she asked to see my passport. I'd never been asked that by a stranger, and my first reaction was just to say that I didn't have it. So she left that alone. She kept scooting closer to me the entire ride, even when there was no room for her to get closer, and I was pretty much up against the window. There was a group of kids around my age sitting near us that kept looking over. She casually touched my thigh as she was talking to me, so I gave that group of kids the help me look, and they just laughed. You might be wondering why I didn't move seats, and I don't really know why I didn't. This was the first time I'd had something like this happen, so I guess I didn't really think about it. Anyway, she started asking me which school I go to, where I live, and just really personal questions like those. I just told her I'm not going to share that information with a stranger. She seemed a bit offended, but let that go too. She also did something else that was pretty sketchy. She handed me a business card and told me that she could help me find a house if I needed to move at any point. I didn't need to move, but took the card anyway because it didn't look like it came from a realty firm or anything, and I was curious. It was white with some hot pink-filled text boxes, black writing, I think, almost a bubble letter font. Very unprofessional for someone who presumably sells houses. Once I got home, I looked up the business name on the card, and it was some crappy phone company or texting service or something like that. I'm not even sure it was a legitimate business. I also looked up her name on the card, and I didn't find any pictures of her or a record of her on the website for that business. That part creeped me out even more, and I immediately threw the card away. It was probably the weirdest, creepiest part about the experience. When we got to the stop before mine, I realized it would have been a good idea to get off a stop early to throw her off in case she had ill intentions. But since we were already leaving it, I planned on getting off one stop after mine. Then, as we were nearing my stop, she reached out to touch my hair, saying it looked so soft. I dodged her hand and said something like, "Okay, that's enough," and jumped out of my seat and got off at my actual stop. She didn't make any attempt to follow, but I walked in the opposite direction of my house just in case she was looking out the bus window or something. The whole way home, I kept checking over my shoulder, even though I knew it was impossible for her to be following me. I haven't seen that woman since it happened, and I hope that I never do.
I've never told this story to anyone other than my closest friends, but this felt like a good outlet to finally get it off my chest publicly. There's something called the 6 degrees of separation theory, which basically states that everyone in the world is separated by at most 6 steps. Well, I'm separated from Trent Reznor, 9 Inch Nails mastermind, by just 1 step, and it was due to a stalker. Back in 2006, I was living in Atlanta, Georgia, and I had just joined a pretty particular punk band, which mixed a very loud sound with cabaret-like visuals. We never made it big, but our act was appealing enough that it got us the attention of many people. One of them was a strange girl who was always chain-smoking, had a weird aura to herself, and who was always wearing a jacket on her shoulders, meaning her arms were not in the sleeves, and who eventually said she wanted to be our manager. She said she was friends with Slash of Guns N' Roses, that she had managed a couple of bands when she used to live in New Orleans and whatnot, so we decided to hear her out. Our band was sort of crazy, so drugs passed around freely in our parties. This girl, she told us her name was Christy something, would provide us with party favors sometimes. She would tell us that she was worth $2 million, that she had 5 cars, that she worked in this luxury building, and that she had a huge house somewhere in the suburbs. The thing is, though, she was always picking cigarette butts from the street and smoking the filters like she was a homeless person. Something about her just didn't click particularly with me. She always came to see us in sort of a fancy SUV, so we went along with her stories for the most part. Eventually, Christy fell hard for me, told me she was divorcing her husband and that she wanted to be with me. I was intrigued by her, and so I started testing all her stories. I asked to visit her at her office. She would always make excuses as to why I couldn't, until eventually she told me her office had closed down and that they were looking for new space. I asked her why she was using the same car if she had like 5, and again excuses and more excuses. I asked to visit her at her huge house, and the same thing. She would come up with off reasons as to why she couldn't have me for a visit, mostly that her husband was still there and whatnot. I started to get sick of all her excuses, and eventually confronted her, and I told her that I thought she was a big fat liar. She got desperate, started to make more excuses, and I just told her to get lost. She had already had a previous fight with some of my bandmates before, so she had already been discarded as our prospective manager. She started calling me every day asking to see me. I would constantly tell her no, till one day she showed up at my house around 5 a.m., apparently wasted. See, she said she had picked up this guy friend of hers to go to a party, but that he was too drunk, and that he was now passed out in her car, and she didn't know what to do with him. I looked across the street and saw no one in her car, and she said it was because the guy was laying down. I didn't really feel like bothering going into her car to check it out. She eventually started crying, and I had felt bad enough for her that I let her come into my living room. It was at this point that she took off her jacket, and for the first time ever, I realized she was missing her entire left arm. I was already giddy by her showing up at my house drunk and all, that I didn't ask what had happened. I know this has nothing to do with my story, but it was something that just added to the already weirded out atmosphere. I hung out with her for a while. At this point, I started doubting that she was actually drunk. I gave her coffee. I told her to please never show up at my house like that again, and eventually told her to just drop the guy off at a Waffle House and then just go home. It might not have been the most responsible thing to tell someone in that state to drive, but I just wanted the whole thing to be over. And like I said, I felt that she was acting drunk the whole time, and she seemed okay enough to drive. She eventually left, and that was that for that night. Next day, again she started stalking me on my phone, to the point I just stopped picking up. I worked early hours, and she would call me at 2 or 3 a.m., completely drunk. I eventually got sick of it all and told her to stay away from me and to never call me again. She complied, and for about a week it seemed like the whole thing was history. Around 6 days later, she calls me again when I was at work. I started telling her that she wasn't supposed to call me, but she said that she could finally invite me to her house, and that she wanted me to come visit her. All sorts of red flags went up for me, so of course I told her to forget about it and just hung up on her. She again started calling me at late hours, to the point that I had just to turn off my phone at night. Otherwise, I would never get a good night's sleep. I remember it was Friday after waking up. I had a voicemail on my phone. Left around 2 a.m. I checked it out, and it was her saying, "Hi, Max. I just took 200 pills, and I've been drinking all night. I just wanted to say goodbye, and that I love you. Good luck with the rest of your life." Needless to say, I got totally weirded out. I was so sick of her lies. I just deleted the message, completely assuming it was one of her ploys to get me to call her. I decided to forget about it and went to work. Next Tuesday after that, I get another voicemail from her phone, but this time it was a guy's voice. "Hi, Max. This is Christy's husband. I'm calling her friends in her contact list to let them know that she passed away last Friday, and we're doing a memorial for her downtown Atlanta tomorrow. If you want to go, please call me back so I can give you the address." I can't even explain how I felt at that point. I was shocked. and I tried to evade the news by thinking that this was some guy that Christy had manipulated into calling me, just to get me somewhere at some time. But of course, the whole situation didn't make much sense to me. This guy eventually called another one of my bandmates, whose name was in Christy's contact list. I had told my band about this entire situation, so my bandmate, who had been suspicious of this girl for a while, started prying this guy for more info. We eventually learned that she used a fake name with us the whole time, that her real name was Amber Applebaum, and that she was using a made-up name because she had been in trouble with the law. We Googled her, and sure enough, turns out she had stalked Trent Reznor in the past, and even managed to steal his credit card info. She even was arrested for it. I was stunned at this point, unsure of what to do next. We never went to the memorial. We were way too suspicious to do it. To this day, I still don't know if this girl committed suicide for real, or if the whole thing was just a sham to get me in some trouble. But since I never heard from her again, I doubt it. Or maybe she's been using a fake name ever since, and decided to move on with her life. I'll never know, but it's definitely the worst way to get 1 degree of separation with someone famous. I got rid of my cell phone after that, and it took me 3 years until I felt okay enough to get a new one. I really never want to go through something like that, ever again.
I work in a fairly busy hospital downtown in the NICU, Neonatal Intensive Care Unit. I usually work at night, and I kid you not, this happened to me less than 5 minutes ago. During orientation, we are taught to be observant to the signs of a possible abductor. We were taught to look for oversized clothing, bags, and shifty behavior. Luckily, I've never encountered a strange individual until just now. It's currently 2:59 a.m., and I've been sitting at the front desk since 11. I'm a nursing student, so I usually just do clerical work around the unit. I also watch the cameras to make sure no one is here that isn't supposed to be here. It's usually pretty quiet at night. However, I've already had sort of a weird night, so this just adds a cherry on top of it. The NICU and most of the second floor is a locked unit. This means that in order to gain entrance, you have to pick up a phone, which then rings to the desk. Usually it's parents wanting in to see their babies and family members who are lost. It quiets down around 11, so no one usually comes in or out during my shift, with the exception of housekeeping. One of the security cameras is situated so I can see who is picking up the first phone. I had been sitting here browsing Reddit when the phone rang. I glanced over at the phone, thinking it was a parent wanting an update or something like that. It took me a second to register that it was the number for the first set of doors' phone. I picked it up and looked over to the screen. There was a lady in baggy clothing with a sling on her arm. I answered the door and she said she wanted to find her cousin, who apparently had been brought up from the emergency department. I asked for the last name, and she unintelligibly rambled off a Latino name that I only caught the first part of. Knowing that we did not have any new admissions, I told her we didn't have anyone by that name. I tried to get some information out of her, and she said again that her cousin had been brought up from the ED. I told her in that case she would want to go to labor and delivery to talk to them. She hesitated and then said okay and walked away. I got a really weird feeling from her, so I checked the census to see if there was anyone that was being assessed in labor and delivery, and there wasn't. So either she was at the wrong hospital or she wanted into the unit to do something a little more sinister than just see her cousin. I shrugged it off and figured that her cousin was in labor and delivery, that she would find her and all would be well. About 5 minutes later, the same lady appeared in her extremely baggy clothing and her sling. The only difference was that this time she was putting the sling on and was using her injured hand to mess with something in her oversized sweatshirt. She picked up the phone and once again asked to be let in to find her cousin, and that labor and delivery said that they had no one by that name. I told her the exact same thing, and that she would need to get in contact with her cousin and go back over to labor and delivery. She got hostile for a second and then hung up the phone. Whether or not she was trying to gain access to the unit for things that she shouldn't be doing, I'll never know.
I hope you enjoyed the video, guys. Thanks for watching, and make sure to leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe to the Sinful Nation and Worst Nightmare. Again, I want to thank Worst Nightmare for doing such an amazing job, and it was a real pleasure working with you. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen.